Welcome to Eye on Korea, a video podcast produced by the Korea Economic Institute of America. Join us for in-depth conversations with experts and policymakers as we explore issues in Korea's economic and political relationship with the United States and how these issues may influence South Korea's regional strategies and its global relationships. I'm Scott Snyder, President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute, and today I'm joined by Dr. John Blaxland. Dr. John Blaxland is director of the Australian National University North America Liaison Office and professor of international security and intelligence studies in the Strategic and Defense Studies Center, Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs, College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. A former Australian military intelligence officer, he is a trusted and highly regarded historian who has authored or co-authored over a dozen broad-ranging works on international military and security affairs. Dr. Blaxland, welcome to Eye on Korea.
Good to be with you, Scott. Thanks for having me here.
And we also thank you for your forthcoming contribution to KEI's flagship journal, Korea Policy.
Thank you.
In which you discuss Australian views on recalibrations in the Indo-Pacific, which is the theme of the issue, and especially in the context of the Trump administration. The full issue and all the papers will be available on KEI's website at keia.org next month, and we will add a link upon release of the publication to the show notes for the podcast as well. There are a number of themes in your article that I wanted to explore with you on Eye on Korea, and I think the most significant one is the thesis that you put forward that, quote, Australia and South Korea as U.S.-aligned middle powers in the Indo-Pacific are increasingly engaging in direct bilateral and multilateral cooperation independent of U.S. facilitation or encouragement. And of course, in the Biden administration, there was a lot of discussion about the lattice work, and the Biden administration was encouraging that as a supplement to the, or possibly a replacement to the U.S. hub-and-spoke security arrangements. But that looks a little bit different in the context of the Trump administration. And so I wanted to ask you, just to start off, to elaborate on some of the challenges for the region and for South Korea-Australia cooperation that the Trump administration poses for the region.
Yeah, Scott, thank you. It's been great to participate in with the Korea Economic Institute on this forthcoming publication. Thank you for including me. It's very interesting to reflect on the overlap of interests and concerns between the Republic of Korea and Australia, both trusted U.S. allies, long-standing security partners of the United States. Significant spokes in the hub and spokes arrangement of the Cold War, and ones that have ties going back to the Korean War. Australia has hundreds of men who died in that war, thousands who were injured. A significant air, land and sea contribution to the campaign from the outset. Particularly, actually, Australian Mustangs escorting B-29s at the very outset, a deployment of the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment early into fight in the Busan perimeter, and then campaigning throughout with most of the 28th Commonwealth Brigade eventually coming from Australia with elements from Britain and New Zealand in particular, fighting as part of the Commonwealth Division, as it was known, with Canadians and Brits and Indians and others as well. Relatively speaking, small component of the scheme. Most Australians have forgotten about that. That was, 75 years ago we started our involvement in that war, and yet what we've seen is a resurgence of enthusiasm and interest in Australia-Korea relations, I am particularly fond of former Ambassador Bill Patterson, the Australian ambassador, who is engaged in I'd actually served with him in Thailand previously. He was posted to Korea, but we've stayed in good contact, and he was instrumental in deepening and broadening the ties, economic and security ties between Australia and Korea. We've got the Korea-Australia Free Trade Agreement, and we've seen in the last few years a significant deepening and, as I say, broadening of security ties as well. So with that, a significant increase of appointments and exercises directly with Korea, alongside the United States often enough, but with a view to seeing that spoke-to-spoke connection deepen and become more substantial. And that certainly happened. You're right. A lot of that happened under the Biden administration, but it predates the Biden administration as well. And I think we could see both Australia and Korea recognizing that with a lot of headwinds, we're facing both experiencing sanctions from China, Korea earlier than Australia over Lotte and other, particularly with the THAAD deployment a few years ago, Australia over objecting to or calling for an investigation into the COVID-19 and what happened in Wuhan. This generated this very similar reaction. So Australia and Korea have had lots of points of intersection to swap notes on. And of course, Australia's physically a lot further removed from China than Korea, but both are very strong trading partners with China and yet both strong security partners with the United States. Both of them have kind of been a little bit taken aback by what I call the transactional retreat from ideational leadership by the United States. This is, we look on the United States, we see, it's the San Francisco Treaty. That's not the Moscow Treaty. It's UN headquarters is in New York. That's not an accident. The United States has been foundational and instrumental in the generation of the so-called rules-based international order, which is we've all kind of known and love over the years, and which people are decrying more and more now and saying, what rules-based order? I like to think it's a bit like the Holy Roman Empire. Not holy, not Roman, not an empire, and yet you don't want it to go away. We actually still value it. And middle powers like Australia and Korea rely on it. We actually we export, we share with each other, confident that pirates won't get the ship, no torpedoes will sink it, and when it gets to the other end, the deal will be honoured. And if not, we can take them to the partner to arbitration. But the partnership between Australia and Korea is now deep. It's trusted. It's established. And it seems to be on a trajectory to be enduring.
Yeah, well, thank you, especially for listing all those points of intersection between Australia and Korea and actually dealing with the same framework. And so I think that what is really interesting at this moment is really the discussion and the thinking about strategies for dealing with a security and economic environment in which the architect has abandoned the stage to some degree. And so I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about how you see Australia's and South Korea's best strategies for dealing with that particular circumstance.
Yeah, so I'd push back a little bit on that. I don't think the United States has abandoned the stage. It's viewing the stage in a very different light. And it seems to be playing, as I say, a much more transactional game where Korea and Australia feature. But despite the incredibly constructive, positive bilateral trade relations between Australia and Korea, the US and Korea and the US and Australia, the imposition on tariffs, this kind of sense of being a much more competitive, dare I say, even adversarial trading relationship where there's almost a punishment imposed for not being America. It's like, well, it's hard to kind of, I think pundits in Australia and Korea are struggling with this. And of course, we've just had an election in Korea. We've had one in Australia, in which case both countries have elected centre-left governments to replace what was there before. In Korea's case, a conservative government. In Australia's case, there was a prospect of a conservative victory overcoming the first term of a centre-left government that pundits basically broadly identify as having been, in the case of the Australian centre-left party, the beneficiaries of Trump's rhetoric, which damaged the centre-right conservatives who were seen as being too closely aligned with Trump, in a way similar to what happened in Canada, where Pierre Poilievre, who was outspokenly critical of the previous Trudeau government in Canada, was then started to use terminology that echoed the Make America Great kind of campaign rhetoric, which sounded clever until it no longer did. And of course, that then reverberated terribly badly for Pierre Poilievre. And of course, Mark Carney came out and romped it in as Prime Minister of Canada, in a way echoing very much what's happened in Australia with Anthony Albanese, who was a bit nervous about his prospects of winning election, come back with an extraordinary majority, a resounding win for the centre-left party, giving them a political dominance today in politics that is very hard for the centre-right conservatives or anyone else to counter. And that's the context in which both Australia and Korea are now finding themselves as kind of centre-left aligned US allies, looking to make the most of the ties, not damage things unduly, but manage to weather the storm, if you like, of tariffs, of a more transactional approach and more making greater demands. And will be interesting to see whether or not the demands of the first Trump administration on South Korea are repeated. We're certainly seeing Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defence, make demands on Australia. The Australian Prime Minister's pushed back on that initially. And there's a question now then, okay, now what? How much are we going to have to, how much of this is going to be a tussle into the future? And of course, in that mix is the question of the AUKUS submarine deal. Just for your listeners, just to recap briefly, AUKUS is the agreement between the UK, Australia and the United States for Australia to acquire nuclear propulsion submarines, initially off the production line from the United States, the Virginia-class submarines, and eventually a co-produced AUKUS surface nuclear SSN submarine with American technology and Australian and British industry involved. That deal is hotly debated in Australia because of the way it was formed, really, the way the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison with then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and then US President Joe Biden struck a deal that seemed to have been cooked up in a way that didn't go through. It wasn't a terribly transparent process. I make the point that, okay, it wasn't terribly transparent, and yet technologically it was a very sound call, I would contend, because for Australia, the problem with diesel electric submarines is that they're no longer fit for purpose for a country like Australia because of the massive distances to cover. To get from Perth to any other port, you have to snort to recharge your batteries about a dozen times to get anywhere, to any other port, not just to go to Southeast Asia or beyond. So, and of course now with almost saturation low Earth orbit satellites from China, coupled with 30 plus years of pattern analysis of how we go and where we go and when we surface, coupled with artificial intelligence and then drones, you're cooked. You can't hide. The only way, of course, to hide is to actually stay underwater. And of course, the only way to do that is nuclear propulsion. So Australia's predicament is it's different to Korea's because Korea's, the distance it has to transit to underwater is much shorter than from Busan to Seoul, for instance. The distances are much shorter than they are for Australia. And that makes for a different set of circumstances. But the whole AUKUS arrangement has come into considerable controversy, in part because people haven't quite gotten on to what's going on. I think in part because the government's been reluctant to push too hard on arguing that it's about pressing back on China, and in part because it wasn't the current government that did the deal. So there's a few angles here that make it a little bit problematic, echoing the problematic relationship that Korea is experiencing with the United States as well.
Yeah. Well, you covered a lot of ground there, including a number of things that I wanted to kind of drill down on. But maybe the one that I want to start with is really we have a new government in South Korea. You mentioned it's a center-left government. From the perspective of Australia, which also has a center-left government, are there complexities in terms of managing relations with the Trump administration that emerge from that? And of course, the other underlying factor is really the competition with China. And so, in the context of Korea, the debate about how to manage the Sino-U.S. rivalry is there.
Of course.
Right.
And look, it echoes the debate in Australia. Yeah. And, the two governments ago, the government of Scott Morrison that stitched the AUKUS deal together, they were accused of, generating a lot of friction with China, pushing back on the COVID, and being more forthright. Now, arguably speaking a bit too loudly with a small stick, if I can twist that Teddy Roosevelt kind of axiom. And the current government that's now in its second term has sought to bring some stability to the Australia-China trading relationship. And part of that has been by presenting a small target, by not being controversial, not reacting too strongly to Chinese provocations. So, for instance, just last year we had a People's Liberation Army Navy, a flotilla, circumnavigate Australia, conducted naval gunnery exercise in the flight path between New Zealand and Australia, directly between Auckland and Sydney, the two largest cities, and giving 30 minutes notice, demonstrating very clearly that China is here and China is powerful and China is not to be ignored. And yet the Australian government was very reluctant to use any kind of particularly adversarial or aggressive or forthright rhetoric to counter China's actions. And this fits in with this sense of we're trying to present speak more softly and try and get the stick to look a bit bigger, if you like. And I suspect there's a similar phenomenon happening in South Korea, which is driving perhaps an interesting intersection for both governments.
Yeah, certainly on the maritime security front, there's been some contacts in the news between China and South Korea that seem like a parallel to that.
Yeah.
So most recently, we had the G7. President Trump left early. It actually was also an opportunity for South Korea's new president, jae-myung, to meet with Australia's leader, Anthony Albanese. Right. Yeah. What was your take from that meeting, and where do you think the main momentum in the Korea-Australia relationship might be going forward under these two leaderships? Yeah,
so it was a very positive meeting. The kindred spirits, really, I think. So politically very sympathetic of each other's positions. And of course, there's a wonderful complementarity trading-wise between Australia and Korea. We export stuff that Korea wants, and Korea exports stuff that we want. So, in fact, it's amazing the array of goods coming out of Korea today that are hot property in Australia. Korean goods are extremely highly regarded, it's high quality, and that's across, all the high-tech space, vehicles, telecommunications, and of course, increasingly now also in the military equipment space. So we've got manufacturing facilities set up in Australia. The question then is whether this government in Australia will have an appetite to double down on that. And I think, a hard-nosed realpolitik interpretation of things would suggest that maybe it's in Australia's interests to actually help facilitate greater Korean investment and industry in Australia by upping the orders of equipment from sunk cost investment that Korea's made in Australia. And my sense is previous governments have kind of seen this as a way of mitigating the risks associated with the kind of just-in-time supply chain that we got used to in the good old days of the post-Cold War era, which is now clearly the unipolar moment time, as well and truly past now, evidently. And so there's a recognition of the need for resilience, for a bit of redundancy and a bit of spare capacity. That I think that's evident from the Koreans in setting up facilities in Australia. And in Australia, of recognising actually we're pretty vulnerable too, because we're a maritime trading nation, pretty much living around the periphery, mindful that most of the interior is arid and inhospitable. So that means that there's some opportunities for more if the South Korean government can persuade the Australian government to see that like-mindedness is worth persevering and pursuing further, particularly on the defence industrial front. I think there's significant opportunities there.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. We know that South Korea has been growing quickly in terms of its defence exports. And also you mentioned that there's some investments from South Korea and Australia in the defence sector. Also, both South Korea and Australia are investors in the U.S. shipbuilding sector.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. And so I'm wondering, in that context, do you see Korea and Australia in the shipbuilding sphere as frenemies? Are they more competitors, or are they more cooperative? How would you describe what's happening in that sector?
So, I think historically they've probably been frenemies, but I think we're facing a set of circumstances today where there is more demand than supply, and therefore there isn't necessarily a need to view this in a zero-sum competitive way. So there's prospects for Austal, the Australian shipping company, and Korean equivalents to multiples to capitalise on the opportunity that presents itself in the US market to work collaboratively with the US government and the United States in defence industrial space to do more together, more in parallel, I should say, and more together as well. And as I say, that's already happening in Australia, and I think there's opportunities for that to happen on a greater level into the future. There's some big contracts coming up for discussion, for decision in Australia in the next little while concerning future frigates. And I'm not exactly sure how that's panning out. I'm not privy to the details of that, but I know Korea's been in the mix. And I think there's some significant, as I say, overlap of interests and shared priorities that would see both of these countries benefit from doing more together.
Finally, as a last question, I want to ask you about the relationship between AUKUS and especially AUKUS and Pillar 2 and Korea. Is that a place where Korea might engage, or is that better place to be handled bilaterally in the Korea-Australia relationship?
Yeah, so AUKUS Pillar 2, it's worth just unpacking this a little bit. Here we're talking about advanced technologies, defence applications of artificial intelligence, of hypersonics, of precision navigation and timing technologies, of precision-guided munitions, and a range of cutting-edge technological innovation with military applications. And in that space, clearly Korea is doing really an outstanding job. They've got a lot to offer. Australia actually has some really very good small to medium enterprise technologies that are world standard, but they're just not very well resourced. They're not. They don't have the critical mass to operate on a big scale because they're just not getting government contracts for that to happen. So there's an opportunity for greater collaboration there on the research and development front too, because we these companies have already got reasonably robust, mature concepts. There's a question about how we can collaborate to actually get to the next level, mindful that none of this is static. All of this technological advancement is in a very fluid space. And what we've seen manifest in Ukraine and over Iran and Israel in the last few days and weeks and months points to the fact that the technological space is it's a very fluid one, and there's a requirement just from a purely self-interested defence perspective, to stay at the forefront of technological innovation and make sure that our forces are as best prepared as possible for contingencies that could arise in the future, and to generate the deterrent effect that we want to have alongside partner nations. And in a way that is actually conducive to encourage the United States to want to remain engaged in a way that they haven't shown that much enthusiasm for beyond the rhetoric at Shangri-La in the last few months.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. It suggests that as middle powers, as defense partners, as allies of the United States, there's a lot on the agenda, and that the relationship is on a positive trajectory.
Yeah, it is. So I'm hoping also that the U.S. administration will not see this in zero-sum terms, but see this as a complementary aspect of how US interests are furthered by encouraging Australia and Korea to do more themselves and to collaborate more closely with each other, and try and look beyond a purely transactional short-term, look at what this means, but think longer term about the benefits of a bolstered capability in Korea and a bolstered capability in Australia and a bolstered ability for Korea and Australia to work together. Now, of course, Australia and Korea, having been, as spokes in a US alliance over the last 80-odd years, has meant that technologically we're very, very similar. So in terms of operations, tactics, techniques, procedures, protocols, technological protocols, there's a huge level of compatibility.
And we'll have to see how that unfolds, and maybe we'll have you back on a future episode of Eye on Korea. But thank you, John. And thank you for joining us on Eye on Korea. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss the next one, and leave a review to help others discover the show. Follow the Korea Economic Institute of America on social media, or visit keia.org for more resources, events, and expert analysis on Korea. We'll see you next time on Eye on Korea.